Alright, now we're going to go over the difference between textures, and particularly procedural textures versus file textures, and also 3D textures. Let me make this cube invisible for now, ignore that. So, a bit of a recap on how to view things. 4, 5, 6, 7. 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, 6 is texturing, and 7 is lighting. So, when we're modeling, go between 4 and 5 a lot. When we're doing rendering and such, we go between 6 and 7 a lot. You'll see that all these images on the objects turned on, 5 shading just shows some colors on objects. So if I just have some object that happens to have a color, the color shows up here, but the color on these things is an actual texture. So if I look over here, it's looking into here to find this earth texture that I attached to it. And this thing over here is referencing something on its incandescence to make this glowing marble. It looks like lava veins or something. And the ground just has a simple checker texture attached to it. So let's go over how to make something with a texture as opposed to just a material. So I'll assign these something new. So a texture is something you plug into one of these checker boxes over here. It can be any one of them. I'm going to go to color, and I've got a bunch of options here. For right now, I'm just going to stick to the 2D stuff. Bulge, checker, cloth, file, etc., etc. I'm going to intentionally do what are called the procedural ones. Procedural means that if I click on bulge, for example, it's assigned this pattern, which is being generated by the machine. So you can see I can actually determine the properties of this bulge. It applies over the objects. The computer is just generating this. It's not something it's pulling from somewhere else. Also, there's a little button right here. See these two buttons? One is an arrow going into a box, one is an arrow going out of a box. This means I'm going in and out of a hierarchy. When I get to the actual hypershade later on, and I'll show you how these things are stacked together, you'll see more and more how that's important. But if you want to go back to the main material, I can press this box to go up, back up to this area. You can see the plugin now has the arrow going into a box, into the box, out of the box, going into what's assigned to the color, going back up to the main stuff. Or you can just click on the objects and go back to here. And if I want to change my mind on which procedural I'm using, I can right click on color and say break connection. And let's go ahead and assign it the ramp. You will recognize this if you've used any paint programs before. It's basically the same thing as you have in Photoshop and such. You can move around the two colors assigned to it and actually change what color they are. You can also add new ones. So I could make a rainbow starting with green, and in the middle I add a new one, which is yellow. After that, red, maybe some blue, and then back to green, I suppose. I don't know if this is an accurate rainbow, but it is rainbowy. Behold my rainbow texture. And on a type, I can change all sorts of stuff. Like, I can change how it's distributed. A V ramp and a U ramp. Just know we're going to talk about UVs in class. Basically, it's X and Y. This is sideways. This is vertical. Now it's applying across them differently. Diagonal, you'll see various bizarre options. There's my radial map. And the interpolation determines how it's going between these. Interpolation of linear, it just says blue, go to red, and purple was in between them. If there's none, it's just blue, red, yellow, that's it. If it's exponential up, I think that means it's got a lot of blue at first and goes to red gradually. Off the top of my head, I don't know. Smooth is a classic, just makes these blend together nicer. So, this procedural texture I've assigned to my objects, and again, you can assign stuff to anything, so I could assign a procedural texture to the transparency. Go in here, go to checker. Remember, white is transparent, and black is opaque, or not see-through. So there you go. I can add more and more bits of stuff to these textures, adding just more and more bizarre things. Now they're glowing like the rain of cloth or something. It's a little hard to say just what exactly is actually being constructed here, because I'm going nuts. But take some time, jump in here, and assign some textures. But before I do that, I want to point out Those are all procedurals. Those are all generated by the computer. Sometimes we just assign files. It's just raw data, a picture. So if I go in here and go to File, you have to bounce back over here and go to this folder. And this is an important time for your project folders to be in good order. This is my LBC animation folder under source images. Remember, whenever you open up anything in Maya and you want to load something, if you want to open a scene, if you want to load a texture, you'll get the same menu, but don't go browsing. If this doesn't just end up on the right folder you're looking for, you should make sure first that you say, all right, I want to know if I'm assigning textures to these things, I know where I saved all my textures, and I want to know where to look for them. So I'd go to File, Set Project, and tell it, yeah, LBC Animation. This is where I know I'm kept my images. I'm going to click there. Instead of browsing, you should just see the things right away. And there's my Earth. And you'll notice that on the cube, these textures often don't look quite right, and often they don't flow across the orb the way you want. We'll go over how to place textures on objects later on. Right now, just make them colorful. You'll notice, though, that by default, a sphere, when it's given an Earth or a moon texture or something like that, any of these textures, which are just a map where the poles are the top and the bottom, it just fits on perfectly. Due to a fun coincidence, these planetary textures just happen to go on spheres perfectly. Anyway, mess around with some procedurals, mess around with some files, make sure they're under source images, and then watch the next video.